I'm Tracy Sabol. Tonight on EWTN News Nightly, in the balance, the Supreme Court hears arguments regarding a challenge to a pro-life measure in Florida. Student loans, while Republicans are pushing back against a new proposal by the Biden administration. Praying for peace. U.S. bishops are speaking out on behalf of Christians facing a humanitarian crisis. And fit for a queen, how people in the United Kingdom are honoring a beloved figure on the anniversary of her death. These stories and more tonight.
From EWTN, the Global Catholic Network, this is EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you for being with us on the Feast of the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Our top story tonight, the Supreme Court has taken up a challenge to a pro-life law in Florida. The justices heard arguments today in a case regarding the state's ban on abortion after 15 weeks. Planned Parenthood is among the groups that filed the suit. They say a clause in Florida's Constitution protects access to abortion. State attorneys say the clause does not apply to abortion. A Supreme Court ruling likely will impact whether a 6-week ban recently signed by Governor Ron DeSantis will be allowed to take effect. The nation's highest court is also being asked to reject limits on a commonly used drug for abortions. The lower court has restricted mail-order access of the drug. The manufacturer of mifepristone says the lower court is wrong to supersede approval by the FDA. Well, New York City Mayor Eric Adams said this week that its current migrant crisis will, quote, destroy the city. With an estimated 110,000 migrants arriving in New York City over the past year, Democrats are starting to point blame at an unlikely source. President Joe Biden. Democrats Pat Ryan, Josh Riley, and Laura Gillen have all publicly criticized the president for not taking action on the issue, even saying that this could hurt his re-election chances in 2024. And here to shed light on this Democratic infighting and more is former Virginia Attorney General and Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security in the Trump administration and senior fellow at Center for Renewing America, Ken Cuccinelli. Ken, great to have you back on the show. I first want to get your reaction to what's happening between these New York Democrats and the leader of their party, Joe Biden.
So I think the simple answer is they have crossed their breaking point. Eric Adams literally was talking about this destroying his city, and what the entire influx of New York City is less than 1 month of border crossings. And that is destroying the city, as far as he reports, that they can't handle it. Now, mind you, this is from a mayor who ran as a sanctuary mayor of a sanctuary city, but those chickens are coming home to roost, and he is not alone. As you pointed out in your report, there are other Democrat mayors from other sanctuary cities who, now that they actually have to live with even a small portion of the consequences of their political virtue signaling, are crying uncle. And the uncle they're crying about is Uncle Joe. They are complaining a great deal now, suddenly, about his unwillingness to help them avoid this problem.
Yeah, and that leads me to my next question, Ken. I mean, why do you think President Biden isn't taking charge, as Pat Ryan has said on a number of occasions?
Well, he's got his hands tied here. He is caught between two constituencies, and he long ago sold his administration out to the radical left, erase the border, erase America activists within the Democrat Party. It's worth knowing for your viewers that Democrat voters, not all voters, just Democrat voters, have disapproved of Joe Biden's immigration policies within 2 months of him being sworn in as the president of the United States. Ordinary Democrats in your neighborhood don't agree with these policies. And by the way, we're seeing that in loud tones in New York City, in Chicago, in these cities that have been inundated with the consequences of the policies they've spoken in support of, the open borders policies. And their own citizens are now screaming about what it's doing to their schools, to their neighborhoods, to the crime and threats to them and their children. And it's very serious. And the only way to fix it is to secure the border. And Joe Biden has shown no interest in doing that.
Yeah, I also want to talk about this, Ken. I mean, in a similar vein, a federal judge in Austin on Wednesday ordered Texas to remove those river barriers that the state assembled along a stretch of the U.S.-Mexico border in order to kind of, keep the migrants away. Governor Abbott says that decision just prolongs Biden's unwillingness to handle the border crisis. What do you think about that, and what do you think Texas should be doing?
Well, they're appealing it, and the Fifth Circuit has already stayed the decision. What that means is that the judge's order will not be implemented. Texas will continue to be able to use its water wall to fend off invaders of their state because they're an international border. And they have the constitutional authority under Article 1, Section 10 to repel invaders. And that is what Texas has just recently begun doing, just as of this May. Though many of us have been all but begging them to do it for much longer than that. And now the Department of Justice, when Texas defends its own border and the federal government won't, the federal government sues them for doing that. This judge sided with the federal government. I think you're likely to see the Fifth Circuit say when the federal government won't stop an invasion at your border and you're a border state, you can defend yourself. That's what the founders said in the Constitution. The states reserve that right to themselves. The Fifth Circuit gave its first indication that that is how they'll ultimately rule, but that's a few months away.
Yeah, and it's not just the southern border, where we are seeing these illegal crossings. It's happening way up north in states like New Hampshire and Maine as well, with migrants crossing over from Canada. Ken, talk to us a little bit more about this.
So this is a much tougher border because as hot and rugged as the southern border is, it is much more open. It's only 2,000 miles long, whereas the northern border is almost double that. Maybe it is double that. And it's heavily wooded. We have road paths in both countries that come right up to the border with no other barrier. And as you note, New Hampshire, for instance, has seen a huge increase percentage-wise in the number of illegal border crossings. And don't forget Florida. Governor DeSantis down there has been fending off water landings. They've had several spikes where state forces have been ordered by Governor DeSantis into action to keep folks from invading Florida from the Caribbean in the same way that Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, is doing across the Rio Grande. So you are right, this is not exclusively a southern border issue. When you have an administration that lets the world know it's open season on our own country, come in any way you like or can, then guess what? People will try to do that. And the only folks left to stop them are governors who are willing to protect their citizens and our country, like Ron DeSantis, for instance.
Ken, we have about a minute or so left. Quickly, your final thoughts.
Well, I truly wonder how far can this administration go in opening the border and inviting people in and literally opposing domestic political opponents who attempt to fulfill the responsibilities of protecting the citizenry. It is amazing that they're bringing to bear the forces of the Department of Justice to stop states and governors who are trying to protect not only their own people, but our whole country when President Biden refuses to do it. It is truly astonishing. And the only way it's really going to stop is by getting a president who is actually committed to border security, because that's where it all starts.
Okay, we're going to leave it right there. Thank you so much for coming on and for your insights. Really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure. Good to be with you.
More than 4 million people have already enrolled in President Biden's new student debt repayment plan. The Education Department claims that it will lower payments and reduce student debt for 20 million borrowers. Republicans say it is just another taxpayer-funded handout. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales has that story.
Good evening, Tracy. The SAY plan is the Biden administration's latest attempt to get around last June's Supreme Court decision, which struck down President Biden's original plan. The U.S. Education Department says that it expects the new income-driven plan will dramatically shrink monthly payments and even cancel some debts altogether. The plan is supposed to start next July and would cut payments on undergraduate loans in half, eliminate payments for borrowers earning less than $15 an hour, and cancel debt of low-balance borrowers who make 10 years' worth of payments. Many economists put the price tag as high as $558 billion over 10 years. Republicans tell me the plan encourages young people to take on debt.
But there'll be an expense to the Treasury, an expense to the taxpayers, and now we're forgiving principal, by the way. We're not forgiving interest, we're forgiving principal. So people that took loans are getting principal forgiven, so it's free money. I'm not sure that's a deal for all the other taxpayers.
Senator Cassidy is leading a Republican effort to scrap the new plan. Other Republicans tell me it's unfair to others.
President Biden has never made his case to the American people of why he's forgiving student debt. Why not forgive debt that people have incurred because they have cancer? Cancer's not a choice. Going to college is.
Republican Senator Mike Braun of Indiana tells me the plan is unsustainable.
Let's just cut to the chase. If it's cost something, we're borrowing the money to do it, and we can't afford to keep doing that.
In a statement, the Education Department calls the GOP resolution a, quote, political stunt to hurt working families. And Education Secretary Miguel Cardona says the plan is a lifeline to many.
Those who are vehemently opposed to it have not spoken to their constituents who are drowning, who need support, who need to make higher education more accessible.
President Biden will likely veto any Republican efforts to kill the plan, but it will likely face a legal battle in the U.S. Supreme Court. The loan repayment program will start up again in October for the first time in 3 years. At the Capitol, Eric Rosales, EWTN News Nightly.
President Joe Biden begins an overseas trip that will take him from India to Vietnam. First up, the G20 Summit in New Delhi. World leaders are scheduled to discuss everything from food and energy security to the global economy. President Joe Biden lands in India after an overnight flight on Air Force One. In June, the president hosted Prime Minister Narendra Modi for a formal state visit at the White House. The meeting today in India was closed to the press.
This meeting will be taking place at the Prime Minister's residence, so it is unusual in that respect. This is not your typical bilateral visit to India with meetings taking place in the Prime Minister's office.
The U.S. and India are working together to resist threats from China. Prime Minister Modi also defends his own country's human rights record despite ongoing attacks against Christians in India. This weekend, he'll host the G20 Summit, bringing together leaders from around the world. Back here in the U.S., the Director of National Intelligence outlines another threat, cybersecurity, and what it will take to protect people.
We recognize that so much of what's outside of government is part of our attack surface, so to speak, right? That, whether it's critical infrastructure that's mostly owned by the private sector or it's sectors of our private sector, like in the technology areas that we're, need to focus on in order to help them protect themselves because they are of such importance from a national security perspective.
And Vice President Kamala Harris, who just returned from a summit in Indonesia, announces a series of pro-abortion speeches. She plans to visit a half a dozen campuses in what she is calling the Fight for Our Freedoms College Tour. But SBA Pro-Life America earlier wrote, the U.S. shares abortion law standards with human rights abusers like China and North Korea, adding Democrats want to keep it that way. And we have a lot more still to come here on EWTN News Nightly, including threat from North Korea. Pyongyang releases a threatening new weapon. And sowing the seeds, reaction to the Holy Father's recent visit to Mongolia. North Korea is celebrating the launch of a nuclear attack submarine. Leader Kim Jong-un attended the launch of the new vessel, which he described as crucial to counter the United States military. The sub is designed to launch tactical nuclear weapons from underwater. Officials in neighboring South Korea say that the vessel likely is not ready for operational duty. While the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is speaking out on behalf of Christians in Armenia, They have been stuck for nearly 9 months as part of a blockade in a contested territory with Azerbaijan. Bishop David J. Malloy of Rockford, chairman of the Committee on International Justice and Peace, said in part, quote, "With the continued impasse of this conflict and the mounting consequences of this blockade, let us all be of one mind and one accord in our prayers for those suffering from this conflict, to see this impending humanitarian catastrophe averted and to see this conflict ultimately resolved through peaceful means." A reaction continues to pour in following the Holy Father's visit to Mongolia. Pope Francis became the first pope to travel to the East Asian country. One church leader in the country said the Holy Father, quote, "sowed the seeds of harmony." Cardinal Giorgio Marengo also says the trip will build new ties of friendship between the Vatican and the people of Mongolia. There are only around 1,400 Catholics in the sparsely populated country. Earlier this week, the Holy Father said that on his visit he met, quote, "a humble church and a joyful church." Mongolia's ambassador to the Holy See says that the country was very honored to welcome Pope Francis to the country. Jamila Deversharan also said that Mongolia is a country that has a long tradition of freedom of religion.
I'm very much honored to welcome to Pope Francis to Mongolia. And you may know Mongolia is a Buddhist country, and this visit is the historical first ever visit. And people of Mongolia very much appreciate the visit of Pope Francis.
When Pope Francis landed in the Asian country, he received a warm welcome by the faithful, anxiously awaiting his arrival.
The people of Mongolia enjoy the freedom of religion, which is guaranteed by the Constitution of Mongolia.
Pope Francis called the country of Mongolia a symbol of religious freedom. As a country set between Russia and Communist China, it plays an important role on behalf of world peace. Speaking 200 miles from the Russian border to the faithful, the Holy Father said, quote, "Together, let us strive to build a future of peace." Up next on EWTN News Nightly, 1 year later, how people in the UK are honoring Queen Elizabeth on the anniversary of her death. Plus, a story 42 years in the making. We'll explain. Britain is marking the 1-year anniversary of the death of Queen Elizabeth II. Cannons were fired across the nation to mark the commemoration. King Charles III and Queen Camilla attended a remembrance service at a small church where the late Queen worshipped. Finally tonight, a remarkable story of a reunion 42 years in the making. A lawyer living outside of the nation's capital recently made a shocking discovery about his adoption. It started when Jimmy Tyden read an article back in April about babies born in Chile in the 1980s who were taken from their families at birth. That led him to an internet search and finding an organization called Nos Buscamos, or We Are Looking For. And with the group's help, Jimmy Tyden of Ashburn, Virginia, made the discovery of a lifetime. And Jimmy Tyden joins us now to tell us all about his remarkable story and how his birth mother relied on prayer and never gave up on hope, finding out what happened to her son. Jimmy, thank you so much for coming on. We appreciate it. Your story is absolutely incredible. You were born in Chile and adopted at birth, but apparently without your birth mom's knowledge. Tell us more about that.
So I was a victim of a counterfeit adoption, something where I was born 1 month premature, and they targeted women who didn't have a lot of means or resources, and they targeted women who were indigenous, and they targeted women who were in particular having premature babies. And so my mama was a victim of that. She was targeted by that scheme. And so once I was born, before she even held me, they told her that they needed to put me in an incubator, and they took me away. And they never brought me back. They told her that I had died. And when she asked for my body so she could have the dignity of a burial, they told her that it had already been disposed of with the trash.
That is so shocking. I mean, when you discovered the truth about your adoption and your mom and your family in Chile, what went through your mind? I mean, what was your first reaction?
Well, I had reached out to Nos Buscamos because I had seen an article about another man named Scott Lieberman in USA Today that kind of outlined the schemes and the magnitude of these schemes. You know, we're talking tens of thousands of children, like 50,000 babies taken from Chile during this time. This was a well-oiled machine. It was a combination of a lot of players. It was the government, it was the church, it was the doctors and hospitals. And so when I got my adoption paperwork from my adoptive family, I was able to realize that there was 4 divergent stories there, and they were so divergent that they could not all be true. And that's what made me want to reach out to Nos Buscamos.
Yeah, and when you found out the truth of that, I mean, that must have been so shocking, but also a relief.
Yeah, it was. It was, at that point, like I said, I had kind of had an inkling that something didn't make sense. And so when they told me, I was glad to finally have the truth. But at the same time, I was just absolutely shocked. Shocked at the 42 years that were lost, that were robbed from my mama, that were robbed from me. It was very shocking. And then my adoptive family, they were always very upfront and honest with me about being adopted, about being Chileno. I was raised to be proud of both of those things. And they were victims as well. They were led to believe that these were all legitimate processes that they went through the American Adoption Agency, that they made a point to share that they wanted nothing to do with any type of illegitimate means of procuring a child, because they knew those things happened in the world and they did not want to be a part of it. So when I learned this, it was very shocking.
Yeah, but there was, some good moments. Obviously, you got to meet your birth mother. Tell us what that was like. And I understand that she said that she prayed to God that she would live long enough to find out what happened to you.
Right. When we first embraced each other for the first time, it was 42 years, not 43, almost 43, but 42 years after my birth. When we had talked, when we had first met each other, online, she had said, you have no idea the oceans I've cried for you. You have no idea the nights I would lay awake and pray and cry to God to let me know what happened to you. Why you passed, where what happened to you in that hospital. And they targeted women that had no power, no authority, no resources to learn any truth. So she just prayed that she'd be alive long enough to see that day. And so when we held each other, it was incredible.
I bet. An answered prayer for her, for sure. And I'm sure for you as well. It really is a miraculous story, Jimmy. And I'm wondering, I'm sure there's a lot of people out there, maybe not exactly in the same situation, but people who are looking for answers themselves. They're struggling. What would you say to them about maybe not losing faith and not giving up?
I mean, this whole thing messes with your view. It can mess with your faith. It can mess with your worldview. It can mess with your sense of a lot of things. For me, I was in a position where, it messes with. Can you still hear me okay? It's really loud. I should wait.
We can hear you, yes.
You can hear me? Okay. So for me, it was, I would just tell people that if you have it in you to seek out the truth, then you should. I certainly don't think that there's one answer for everybody. I know that for some, this is a lot of trauma, that you have to deal with. You're uncovering decades-old trauma. You're opening up old wounds for your mama, for your adoptive family, for yourself. It's very difficult. And like I said, from like a faith space, I was a pastor, and I will tell you throughout all of this process, it makes you wonder that big question that many people of faith have, which is, why did these things happen? What is God's plan? Was this God's plan? Was the reuniting God's plan? Was the taking God's plan? Why would God let this happen? I mean, it can bring up so much stuff. But in the end, we found something beautiful. I'm lucky enough to have two loving families, one on each side of the equator. And it's going to take a lot to find meaningful reunion. And I pray that the global leaders, right, that the world leaders come together to recognize that these atrocities happened and that they find a way to make meaningful reunion for these families happen. They could set aside funding. They could, make it so that these people can travel forever for their children, for their lineage. I mean, it's not just a child from a baby or a child from a mother and a mother from a child. This is losing your country, losing your nationhood, your identity. So I just hope that everybody finds it in themselves to do the right thing. You can't make these things right, but you can make them better. And I pray that President Boric does that he steps up and the other world leaders join him in identifying these children. Like I said, tens of thousands, almost 50,000, identifying them and then working together to make meaningful reunion.
Yeah, it is a tragic story, but yours is a wonderful one. It has a great ending. And Jimmy, thank you so much for sharing it with us. We appreciate it, and God bless you and your family.
Thank you.
And we thank you for watching tonight. Remember, you can follow us on social media, Facebook, X, and Instagram at EWTN News Nightly. I'm Tracy Sabol. Good night, and God bless.